A shadow fell over him, not from the setting sun, but from a place of pure, cold authority. He was just a boy, his only crime, a moment of foolish pride, a dare from his friends that echoed louder than his own sense. But the towering figure in the bearskin hat didn't see a child. He saw a challenge to an ancient code. In that frozen second, a simple joke spiraled into something dark and terrifying. This is the moment a lesson in respect became a brutal lesson in prejudice. What would you do when the system designed to protect you suddenly sees you as the enemy? Of course, here is the setup section, crafted to your specifications. The sun beat down on the London pavement, baking the city in a rare and sluggish heat. For 15-year-old Jamal, summer freedom wasn't about vacations. It was the simple, sprawling emptiness of days spent with his friends Khalid and Ben. They were a unit, bound by the unbreakable code of teenage boredom and the desperate search for something, anything, to break the monotony. Jamal's world was a small orbit between his family's modest flat, the local pitch, and the corner shop that sold cold drinks. His mother's warnings were a constant soundtrack in his head: be smart, be respectful, don't give anyone a reason to look at you twice. It was a heavy weight for such young shoulders, a lesson his older brother had learned the hard way. But in the safety of his own neighborhood, surrounded by familiar faces and laughter, that weight felt lighter. He was just a kid. Today's mission was aimless, their conversation looping back to theirs. It was Khalid who first pointed him out, a statue of a man standing rigid and unblinking outside the gated entrance. Bet you a $5 you can't make him flinch, Khalid whispered, a grin spreading across his face. To them, he was a tourist attraction, a prop in a red tunic. They didn't see the discipline, the history, or the man beneath the bearskin. They only saw a challenge. Jamal puffed out his chest, the dare buzzing in his veins louder than his mother's voice. It was just a bit of fun. What could possibly go wrong? He had no idea that in a few moments, the color of his skin would transform a childish prank into a dire threat in the eyes of those sworn to protect it. Of course, here is the rising action section, crafted to build tension and highlight the emerging injustice. A surge of adrenaline, mixed with the need to prove himself to his friends, drowned out the quiet voice of caution. Jamal took a step forward, then another, crossing an invisible line from the safety of the pavement into the guard's sacred silent space. He stuck out his tongue, puffed his cheeks, making a grotesque, childish face. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The guard remained a statue, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. Khalid and Ben stifled laughs, and a wave of relief washed over Jamal. He'd done it. He'd won. But as he turned his back to retreat, the air cracked. It wasn't a word, but a sound, a guttural, commanding bark that froze the blood in his veins. The click of polished boots on stone echoed like a gunshot in the quiet square. Jamal spun around. The statue had come to life. The guard had broken his formation, turning his head, and his eyes, no longer distant, were now locked directly on him. But they weren't looking at a mischievous boy. They were narrowed, cold, and blazing with a contempt that was far too old and heavy for such a young face. "Stay right there," the guard commanded, his voice a whip crack of authority. Every tourist in the square stopped to watch. Jamal's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't part of the script. Guards weren't supposed to move. This was supposed to be a joke. Panic, cold and sharp, began to replace his bravado. He took an involuntary step back, a universal signal of retreat, of surrender. But the guard took 2 aggressive steps forward, closing the distance. His hand went to the radio on his belt. Jamal's mind raced. His friends had vanished, melting into the crowd that was now forming a silent, judgmental circle. "This one's causing a disturbance." The guard spoke into his radio, his eyes never leaving Jamal. "Agitated. Potential threat to the post." The words were deliberate, each one a brick in a wall being built around him. Agitated, threat. They painted a picture of a dangerous individual, not a scared child. He was being defined by a perception he had no power to change. The squawk of a response echoed from the radio. Backup was coming. The guard's expression was grimly satisfied. Jamal was trapped, pinned not just by the man in front of him, but by the weight of 1,000 staring eyes. He was no longer a boy who'd made a mistake. He was a problem to be contained. And as the sound of heavy, running boots grew louder from the archway to his right, he knew the real nightmare was just beginning. The system his mother had warned him about had finally found him. The sound of the approaching boots was a thunderous, rhythmic beat of doom. 2 more guards, larger and with faces set in stone, emerged from the archway. They didn't ask questions. They didn't see a terrified child. They saw the problem their colleague had radioed in an agitated threat. In an instant, they were on him. Rough hands grabbed his arms, wrenching them behind his back with a painful twist. The cold, hard cobblestones met his knees as he was forced down. A strangled cry escaped his lips, a protest. A plea, but it was smothered by the sheer impersonal force of their procedure. The weight of a knee pressed into his spine, not to restrain, but to punish. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of gasps and excited whispers, their phone cameras capturing his humiliation from every angle. This was the moment the world shattered. The heat of the sun was gone, replaced by a cold dread that seeped into his bones. He was not Jamal, not a son, not a friend. He was a body on the ground, a spectacle. His face, pressed against the gritty stone, was wet with tears of sheer, utter helplessness. This was more than fear. It was the erasure of his very humanity. He was being made an example of, and the lesson was brutally clear. For him, a moment of childish error would be treated as a capital crime. But then, a new sound cut through the chaos. Not a command, not a siren, but a voice raw, fierce, and cutting through the square with the force of a hurricane. It was a voice he knew would always fight for him. It was the voice of his mother. "Get your hands off my son." Every head, including the guards, snapped toward the sound. The pressure on his back eased for a fraction of a second. In that sliver of silence, the dynamic of the entire encounter was ripped in two. The predator became the perpetrator, and the spectacle became a scandal. The real confrontation was about to begin. Of course, here is the resolution and impact section providing closure and a powerful call to reflection. The charges, of course, were dropped. The official report called it a regrettable overreaction, a sterile phrase that could never capture the terror of being pinned to the ground. Jamal was released into his mother's shaking arms, but he carried the prison of that experience home with him. The swagger of that summer afternoon was gone, replaced by a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. He flinched at sudden movements, avoided authority figures, and the once innocent sight of a uniform now triggered a cold knot in his stomach. The incident was over, but the damage was done. This story isn't unique. It's a pattern repeated in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different streets. It's the story of a system that sees a threat before it sees a person. A narrative where a black child's mistake is criminalized while another is dismissed as a youthful indiscretion. Jamal's humiliation on the cobblestones was a public performance of a private fear that countless families live with every single day. He was lucky. His mother was there. Someone was recording. But what if she had been just a minute later? What if the cameras weren't rolling? We are left with the most haunting question of all. How many what-ifs have already ended in tragedies we never hear about? This is more than one boy's story. It is a mirror. What did you see reflected in it? Did you see a lesson taught, or an injustice served? Your answer to that question is everything. The silence that follows this video is where the real work begins. What will you do when you witness the same bias unfolding in front of you? The world is waiting for your answer.